Hello everybody, welcome to the Armory show and to Armory Live. It's my pleasure to introduce the final talk of the day, Can Data Help Make the Art World More Equitable? Guiding this discussion is Julia Halperin, Art News Executive Editor. Her full biography, along with the rest of the panelists, can be found on the Armory Live section of the website, so I do encourage you to go there for more information. There'll be a short time at the end for some questions, but in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Julia and the rest of the speakers to the stage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Halperin. I am executive editor of Artnet News. And I wanted to start off by talking about what data means in the art world. So if you are anything like me, you got into art or you became interested in art in part because you were not great at math. The art world is generally pretty allergic to numbers. We like to see things and feel things and think through them. And the only thing scarier than numbers is lots and lots of numbers, also known as data. But I am here to tell you not to be afraid. We're here to talk about how data can be used for very different and very worthwhile purposes. To expand our understanding of art history, to expand our understanding of who is making art today, and to expand our understanding of who wants to see and engage with art. In recent years, the art world has become more open to considering data, and interestingly, the data that has been used is often used to highlight inequities in the art world that were previously only felt, but were not fully understood. So one example is the Mellon Foundation. Both the Mellon Foundation and New York City separately sponsored surveys of museum demographics that told us statistics that many who work in museums already felt, which is that white people are very overrepresented, especially in curatorial, educational, and leadership positions. According to the Mellon Foundation study, which was from 2013, 84% of museum staff in those positions in the US identify as white. So at Artnet, we conducted our own survey with In Other Words last year that found similarly bracing statistics when it came to the representation of women in museum collections. We surveyed 26 leading museums across the US and found that only 11% of acquisitions over the past decade were of work by female artists. We also found that the statistics for exhibitions were not much better at those same 26 museums. Only 14% of exhibitions over the previous decade included either solo shows or group shows predominantly of work by women. And the market, as you'll see, reflects a similar bias. We found that over the past decade, only 2% of total auction sales globally were of work by women. And the thing that we found that was most kind of bracing for us was that in museums, the numbers had not improved. So you'll see here, this graph maps museum acquisitions and auction sales over the same period of time. And so, you can see that the auction sales are increasing, even though they remain super, limited considering the number of women artists whose work is in the market. But museum acquisitions actually peaked in 2009. So even though we think that we're getting better, we see all of these articles and reports that there are more exhibitions of and acquisitions of work by women than ever, we can actually see in the numbers that we're stalled. So notably, most museums that we worked with had not gathered these figures before. They collected them for us for the first time. And they showed us that we hadn't made as much progress as we thought when it came to the representation of female artists. And that is the really exciting thing about data. It forces you to check your assumptions, and it shows you that you just can't know what you don't know. So our three panelists are all working in different sectors of the art world and using data to challenge what we think we understand about the way cultural systems work. So before we dive in, I'm going to introduce them. Gamynne Guillotte is responsible for interpretive projects, educational resources, public programs, and visitor engagement at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She has been the Chief Education Officer at the BMA since 2019 and previously served as Director of Interpretation and Public Engagement and Manager of Interpretation. From 2006 to 2012, she was a designer and project manager at the Los Angeles-based design firm Narduli Studio. In the middle, we have Taylor Whitten Brown, who is a cultural and economic sociologist based in New York. She is in the final stages of her PhD at Duke University, and her dissertation explores status and gender inequality in creative markets using computational methods such as machine learning and network analysis, which I look forward to having you explain to me. She recently worked for Facebook as a research scientist and has served as a contributing author for the Art Basel and UBS Global Art Market Report, and has worked closely with Artsy's Art Genome Project for her research. And finally, to my left, we have Camille Morineau, who is the co-founder and director of AWARE, Archives of Women Artists, Research and Exhibitions, a French nonprofit dedicated to creating and distributing information on women artists in the 20th century. She has worked for 20 years in public cultural institutions in France, including 10 years as a curator of the contemporary collections at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. So thank you all for being here. So, Taylor, I actually want to start with you because you are using data to answer a very fundamental and very thorny question, which is, do men and women make different kinds of art? Tell me about why and how you set out to answer that question.
Sure. So I generally study inequality in creative professions, and for my dissertation in particular, I'm studying gender inequality in the contemporary art world. And when I wanted to approach that question, the first thing that my fellow academics in particular, but also people in the art world would mention is like, well, do men and women make different types of art? That might explain some of the inequality in outcomes. You have to address that first. Which is, of course, a huge and complicated question to ask. And I approach it with machine learning methods just because we now have a lot more data to be able to answer it with, but nothing that any single individual could go through and, very subjectively decide whether there's a difference. So I work with, like you mentioned, Artsy's Art Genome Project is a bunch of metadata about artwork and artists, and that's what I use.
So if I were like a middle schooler, explain to me how you use it to answer that question.
Okay. So the metadata on the Art Genome Project in particular is coded by art historians and engineers, and is to help people search the Artsy website. If you go on, you want abstract blue art, this is all within the metadata. The machine learning methods that I use, one of which is called a classifier, is just an algorithm that you train to tell the difference between two different things or more than two different things. I am using a binary classifier for male and female. And so just training an algorithm, giving only the qualities of the artwork, of which in the Art Genome Project there's over 1,000, can the algorithm be trained to correctly predict if the artwork was by a male or a female artist. And there's a lot more to it and ways that it can go wrong, but that's why you need informed practitioners of the methods.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Camille, when you founded AWARE, you were responding, not to an overload of data like Taylor had, but actually a paucity of data. So at what point in your career did you realize that there wasn't enough information about female artists and that you could do something to change that?
I realized that very concretely 10 years ago. Actually, I was working in Centre Pompidou, and I proposed to the museum director to show only women artists in the permanent collection. So I started working. The collection is pretty big, and our floors are pretty big too. It's about 8,000 square meters. I'm sorry about the feet. I think it's like 80,000 square feet. It's a big museum, and I started working that project, and it was really tough working on it because I had all these works in the storage, which hadn't been shown, most of them, by women artists, and zero information on the work. So when you're a curator, you have to organize a room in order to say something, to put an artist in a movement, to share your knowledge with the public. It was extremely difficult for me to do so because information was not out there. There was no books about these women artists, no text within the archive. So I had to produce twice the effort because they were women artists. So I just needed a tool which I didn't have. So I did the show. It lasted 2 years, and I produced an archive, a research archive, and wanted to create a research center within the museum, which was not possible. So I left the museum and I created the tool I had needed, which is Aware, this website, which is basically it's a very simple thing, an illustrated encyclopedia where you can access women artists by their names, their country of origin, the country where they work, the techniques, their subject, lots of keywords, so that people can access the women artists, whether they want to show them, to collect them, to represent them as galleries. Just because, as you said, we think that there have been no women artists, but there have been hundreds, probably thousands of them. But because the information is not out there, public, we think that they don't exist.
And Gamynne, you use data in a very different way than either Taylor or Camille. You use it to understand your audience. So can you tell us a little bit about how you collect and then act on the data that you gather about your audiences at the Baltimore Museum?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of ways that data collection and analysis comes into the work of a museum. And I'd start maybe by framing this as really a conversation for us about relevance and about impact. So in order for us to understand the effect that we're having on our audiences, we have to ask them. And that's something that museums have historically not been very good at doing, is actually framing those questions. And so we do this through a number of both quantitative and qualitative means. We want to know who's coming in our door, so we do demographic data surveys. We do zip code collection and analysis. But we also want to get at that qualitative information as well. What is the kind of meaning that people are making out of our exhibition program and our artistic program, our collection, our permanent collection galleries? And there we're looking at visitor surveys, we're looking at focus groups, as well as really wanting to have a serious conversation and a dialogue with our visitors about what a civic museum means to them and how we can be delivering something that's truly meaningful to them. And so in order to do that, you're talking about much longer and more qualitative engagements. We have community advisory panels, for instance. We'll do front-end evaluation on exhibitions. This is where, this is before you make the nice show, and then you ask your visitors what they think of it, and then you produce a report that usually goes into a drawer someplace. When you're doing front-end exhibition, you're testing the exhibition before it's actually installed, testing the exhibition themes, the checklists, the big ideas in the show, not necessarily to change what the exhibition content is going to be, but to understand where those roadblocks are going to be for visitors so that you can more easily help them through it.
And I'm going to ask you a little bit later to, talk a little bit about a scenario where you've made a different decision based on what you found. But first, one of the things that I think is most interesting about the work in particular of Taylor and Camille is that it challenges our understanding of who makes art and what kind of art they make. And one of the things that came up a lot in our research and reporting for our data study looking at women in museums was that we would come back to museums with the numbers that they gave us, by the way. We just went through them and added them up. And they would say, well, the reason, that this is so low is because, we're looking at a long period of time and there are just fewer women who make art. And therefore, that's just an accurate reflection in our collections. And I wondered if you mentioned, you sort of referred to this a little bit earlier, but I wonder if you can, speak to, given your research, how would both of you respond to that statement and idea?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from a vicious circle. You guys probably can name maybe 5 or 10 women artists, and that's what most of people can name. Maybe curators can name 20 or 30 at the most. So we think they haven't existed just because we don't have the information. If you show the information, if it's a very serious edited information, then the numbers change very naturally. Then you realize you've been missing something. Something is pretty big. So I think information is really the basis for change. A very serious, edited academic information can really make a change. And data, if it's shared, is a very efficient tool to create a new kind of knowledge, a more balanced knowledge, a fair history. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I think obviously people want to reach very far back in history. Unfortunately, not too far back to times when women weren't allowed to do a lot of professions, being an artist included. But more recently, I mean, I think, for instance, the Hilma Klint exhibit at the Guggenheim, the most attended exhibit in their history, showing that there was a woman at the head of the abstraction movement, right? And then, of course, today with any areas of contemporary art in museums, that argument doesn't really hold, that the women just don't exist. There's more than 50% of graduates that are women. And yet in my data, I've discovered this, what I call the obnoxious new rule of thirds, just to myself. This is not like a thing that is out there, that, you know, despite over 50% of graduates and about 50% of visual artists being female, only a third of those gallery represented are female, only a third of sales are female, and it just seems to be this persistently bizarre rule of thirds that I think is still there, but not a good enough argument for why the exhibits aren't.
Well, and it's so interesting too, because the one, when we were doing research to kind of fact check that assertion, one of the things we found was this other, I didn't even think of the rule of thirds, but that there was research done about graduates from Yale School of Art that found that even though graduation rates reached parity in the early 80s, even since then, male graduates were written about 3 times more than female graduates. So you're already getting the history from the get-go distorted.
But then, to bounce back on this idea of education, one of part of the vicious circle about the role of women in history is that a lot of people think that they couldn't get any education until, let's say, the turn of the century, when they could slowly access national schools of art. But that's completely untrue. The truth is that most women artists could find education, a very good one, through private schools. For example, Paris had the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts, which was pretty difficult to enter, even for male artists, but there were a lot of private schools, like Colarossi or others. You had to pay a little bit, and some of them were not so expensive, and we found out, but it's you know, the first steps of a research, that probably between 50 or 80% of the students in these private schools were women. They couldn't go to the national school, whatever. They'd go in a private school, and they got a very good education. So this is a completely a bias about education that completely wipes out the idea that women didn't get an education. They did.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is about how, you know, if you're not, you can be looking at data, but if you're not looking in the right place, you're not going to get the full story. And so I wonder, maybe starting with Gamynne, if you can talk about, you know, in your experience, how can data collection and analysis, if it's not done carefully, actually reinforce bias rather than dismantle it?
Lots of interesting things I think we could all say about that on this stage. You know, one of the things that I think that we see most often pitfalls is actually in how survey instruments themselves are constructed and the biases that get brought into survey instruments. So if I were to hand you guys a 7-point Likert scale right now, and I were to say, how much are you enjoying your experience of the Armory? A little bit, a lot, a whole lot. You see what I'm doing in constructing that question? I'm already creating a false narrative about the experience. I'm not giving you an opportunity to dissent to that narrative, right? So you have to look at how that survey instrument has been constructed very, very carefully. You also have to look at what's not being measured. And I'll give you a very concrete example of this. We have a very popular legacy program at the BMA that is a summer jazz series. It was started back in the mid-90s with the express purpose of expanding the African-American audiences of the BMA. Now, as many of you may know, Baltimore is a majority-minority city. We have the kind of museum visitation that most museums have with the sort of standard museum demographic. And in looking to switch up that demographic, this program was started. And it was touted for many, many years as being the program that doubled our visitation of black visitors to the BMA for this particular program, right? So I got curious about this number because I wasn't seeing an audience that felt to me to be representative of the Baltimore that I knew. And so I said, okay, well, let's look at another question. Let's look at a different kind of metric here. So instead, we ran a zip code analysis on the same numbers. So we are usually about 3.5–4% Black audience. This has changed over the past few years, and we can talk about those numbers now, but this is about 4 or 5 years ago. We're about 8–9% for the jazz series. So we looked at the zip code data for that, and as it turned out, the neighborhoods that audience was from were from the same very, very wealthy, very, very elite neighborhoods that our standard museum visitors are from. And so was the question about audience expansion really one that was about race? Or was it one that was about, equity and access, which is a different kind of question? So A, what are you measuring? And B, are you very, very clear about the question you're actually asking? So
then in that case, did you then reverse engineer and figure out what it was that was driving this shift in audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we ended up doing was looking at a totally different series of audience engagement programs, and so started a completely different set of programming to drive a much more targeted and specific audience. And we were explicit about it in a way that I think that museums are often very uncomfortable about being explicit about audience. We said we want an audience that is more representative of the demographics of the city of Baltimore, which is to say majority minority and skewing young. And we're going to be explicit about saying that. So as many people, I think, who work in the public arts sector will tell you, we use a lot of coded language about audience. We say things like the community. We say things like our publics. And there's a lot of code for what that might actually mean. And you can't actually shift those numbers if you're not explicit about what you're actually measuring for. And that means, part of that is about good data hygiene, part of that's about good coding, part of that's about the good sort of the analytics side of it. But before you can even get there, it's about being really honest about what you're measuring and why.
And speaking of the analytics side of it, Taylor, I wonder if you could speak to this question too, of sort of how you can, if you're not looking carefully at what you're measuring, measure something different that you don't intend to measure.
Yeah. I think, so I study mostly the market side of the art world, where the ambiguity that is appreciated, maybe in the more humanistic side of the arts, is seen more as risk, because uncertainty in a market makes it unstable. And so you kind of cling to any of these anchor points of financial security that you can find. And increasingly, in lots of markets, one of those new anchors is data. And I'm okay with that, I think, because I think data holds a lot of opportunity. Historically, our anchor points were social biases and including some groups, excluding others independent of what they created. And data has the opportunity to possibly hold us accountable, as has been mentioned previous. But in my own work, I've discovered that, if the analysis of that data, if it is not informed, then you can be driven in the wrong way. So a cautionary tale from actually my own dissertation. Like I mentioned, one of the questions I try to answer using machine learning is whether men and women make different types of art. So I'm training an algorithm based solely on the qualities of the artwork to see whether it can tell if an artwork is by a male or a female artist. But depending on how I sample the data, I can get a completely different outcome. And it's my job as a sociologist to understand why it's getting a different answer depending on how I sample the data. But that requires me to really understand the method, and increasingly I think a lot of the art market, companies in the art market will want to rely on, as the magazine you handed me backstage, rely on AI and machine learning to predict prices, to predict stability in the market. But if you're not careful, these techniques are just trained on our own data, our histories of the past. If those are biased, it will just reproduce our own biases. But you can step in, and the cutting edge of a lot of science in these methods now is to step in and make sure that the algorithms themselves are not just reproducing our bias.
And I recall you saying that, when you were saying it depends on how, the outcome depends on how you sampled the data, that the algorithm that you were working with, it got really good at identifying the individual artist. Yes. And then it would then assign that artist a gender based on the name, but that doesn't mean that it was independently capable of saying this artwork is by a man or this artwork was by a woman. It's that it was good at naming the artist and then identifying whether the name of the artist was female or male. Is that right?
Kind of. So
Great.
it wasn't.
Tell me.
Yeah.
Tell me
No,
where I'm wrong.
you're very close. 'Cause it wasn't actually saying the name, like the letters of the name or something, and then saying, oh, says Ashley. It's probably a female artist. What it was doing is that in the training sample of data, so you're training an algorithm and then you're testing it on another set of data. If I included the same artists in the training set and the test set, it would just learn individual artists and then discover them in the test set, which was not my question as a researcher. My question is, without knowing anything about the artist beforehand, only the qualities of their work, can you tell me if it's male or female? So when I sampled differently and I said, train on this set of artists and then predict this other set of artists, it's not doing very well at all. So that's part of the problem though, right? I had to know the history of gender inequality in the art world to be looking out for this problem to begin with. And then I had to understand the methods to then question my own results, which increasingly because of computational power and a lot of off-the-shelf implementations of this software, it's not required that you understand the methods to that degree in order to implement and use them. And that's where it can really start to be dangerous.
And so what you found in the end was no, men and women don't make different art.
It depends. There's certain qualities. Women do tend to make a lot more feminist art, which is kind of unsurprising. They tend to make work more about pregnancy, but by and large, the answer is no. And on the other side, when you match two artists who make very similar types of work, the inequalities in things like listing and sales price still exist. So largely, no, they don't make different types of work, and largely, yes, even when they make the same types of work, there's still the inequality, which is kind of the crux of the first part of my dissertation.
And I mean, jumping off of that, Camille, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of data and information literacy, because so much about this is as much looking at the data that is there, but also the data that is not there, and how we can be critical consumers of data. So, when you're confronted with information like, an index of artists in the back of an art history book, or, you're going into a permanent collection gallery and you're looking at all of the labels, how can we look at that and ask ourselves the right questions?
Well, museums and art historians work from archives. And if the archive is not right, if it's not fair, if it's not balanced, history will be unbalanced. So that's why I think it's important to work on the material, the source, which I call the archive, whether it's digital or real. And if you think about art history, the archive about women artists is non-existent. So what you find in museums or books is just the mirror or the image of that unfair archive. You don't have info, you don't collect these artists, you don't publish them. It's a vicious circle. So in order to find this archive and make history more balanced, the archive needs to be just really serious. It needs to be well done. It needs to be signed as opposed to Wikipedia. It needs to be done by experts and to become like a solid base for new history.
By signed, you mean like bylines, like the authors?
No, signé, yes. Someone signs the text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Take the responsibility of it.
And, I think in the art world, it's very easy for us to think about data as sort of like a nice to have, an add-on that might help you make a better argument, but something that's not sort of essential to the day-to-day work of whatever it is you're doing. And so I wonder if any of you or all of you can think of a scenario where, collecting data actually helped you avoid relying on an assumption that was incorrect. So I want to start maybe with Gamynne.
Sure, all the time. So I'll give a particular example. I think that there is a real danger, especially in rooms and offices full of people who have advanced degrees in art history, that we have an assumed body of knowledge, and we have the same shared body of knowledge, and we can often make that assumption about our audiences. Again, this is why I'm banging the audience drum so hard. It's very important to know who's coming into your museum to understand this. If you have a highly academic audience, you can make some assumptions about that audience. We have a general audience and can make no assumptions about what they will or will not know. So I was working on an exhibition a number of years ago that was co-curating with one of my curatorial partners at the BMA, and it was a thematic exhibition on the subject of home. And we were testing, just doing some object testing with audiences of letting them look at the checklist for the show, walking them through the floor plan, and testing the exhibition themes. And one of the things that came out of that was that a lot of the work was making people unduly emotional. There were a lot of personal connections our audiences were making with the work, and it became very clear to us that if we didn't manage this properly, we were going to be in a position where we were, really leaving our audiences really emotionally vulnerable and not giving them any place to put that down, like not giving them any place to do anything with that. So we actually ended up redesigning the exhibition to create spaces for contemplation and reflection within the flow of the show, to be able to accommodate these things that we're seeing in our audiences. And this is a very small tweak in some ways, but these kinds of enormously important tweaks that we could never have seen on our own. We couldn't have known that without seeing that 85% of the people who came through when we coded the responses to our survey said that they were having kinds of experiences, like we'll do like adjective clusters, and give people 50 adjectives to describe the show. And then as we start to code those adjectives, we start to see what are those sort of big dominant themes that they're pulling out, and that then allows us to make those kinds of course corrections.
How common is that kind of front-end testing?
Not nearly enough. This is still, I think, relatively new to museum practice. This is coming in through your interpretation departments more often than not. Sometimes your marketing departments, although we're looking at really different kinds of data for really different kinds of reasons. So it's still something that we are socializing, I think, the industry itself to, and especially within art museums. It's very, very common within science museums. It's much, much more common within natural history museums, within historical societies. There's a long history of doing this kind of work. But within art museums, we are woefully behind our other peers in other museums.
And I don't know if either of you have anything that jumps to mind about, an experience where looking at data actually sort of upended an assumption that you had or helped you avoid making a mistake.
I think what I've mentioned previously, part of why I asked that initial question of whether men and women make different types of art is that there seem to be differing opinions. So someone was wrong. Someone's assumptions were wrong. And, previous to 5 years ago when we had the type of large-scale, because as a sociologist, I study groups, right? I study large populations. And so I do need a lot of data. And that data didn't exist until the internet started to exist and platforms like Artsy started to exist to answer the questions. So, I think that's probably my paradigm.
My story is about missing data, so it's hard for me to answer because I was misled by the wrong kind of data when I was an art historian until 10 years ago. I didn't have any data on women artists. So I was making the wrong shows, installing the wrong permanent exhibitions, buying the wrong works. So I really needed that data that I'm today constructing. So I think data cannot be wrong if you have an objective, if you're constructing the data seriously, if you're editing it, it's good, it's important.
And I wanted to ask you too about sort of implementation, all of you, but maybe starting with Camille, because it is one thing to gather this information, and then it's another thing to act on it and sort of send it into the world to make a change. And so how do you make sure or work to have this archive that you're building actually, make change out in the world?
Well, because there is no archive about women artists, it's a big responsibility to share it, to construct it and share it. So I have to make sure that this information I'm sending and sharing is super serious. So each text that is written on artists is signed by the expert. So sometimes we take like 6 months, a year to have the best person writing the text. It's translated, it's verified, it's illustrated, and each little step we take is a very solid one. So it's a simple, very serious historic tool, which is based on academics, on universities' research.
And Taylor, how do you see your research, how do you imagine it making a change or living out in the world?
I mean, primarily will be published as papers, academic papers, but a lot of times those will just be read by other sociologists. So I'm very open to working with and have continued to work with journalists and speak with journalists about it, do things like this, which is actually not quite typical for an academic to be on a panel like this, not just speaking to other academics. So I think primarily just through the dissemination of information and holding myself as accountable as possible to making sure that I do all in sociology what we call like the robustness checks and alternative explanations, trying to do my best to make sure that what I put out there is very serious as well. Yeah.
Well, and I would pick up, I think, on the accountability point and just echo that. I think that it's wonderful for us to collect the data that we're collecting. I think it's wonderful for us to make sure that we have clean data sets and be very fearless in the way that we're asking and framing our questions. I think it's quite another thing when we're talking about implementation. And implementation within a social context takes a kind of a moral courage that I think a lot of institutions still struggle with. And so, I'm a big proponent of the theory that you don't ask a question until you are institutionally mature enough to change as a result of hearing the answer. So if you're not ready to hear the answer, don't ask the question of your audiences. And understand that in doing this work, it will change you as an institution. And if you're not ready or willing to be changed, that's not a good way to be engaging in this work.
I would just add to that I think when you come out with these findings, we embed ourselves so deeply within our data and understand the nuances, where it can apply and where it doesn't apply. And a lot of times when you kind of set it out free, it gets totally distorted. And you're like, no, come back, I didn't say that, or whatever it might be. And I think you do have to be able to articulate as best you can what it is that you found, and then go to bat for it, stand by it, correct wherever you can any distortions of what you've said. I think for me, again, studying population level things, something that often happens is what's called the ecological fallacy. I found this group level thing, and then people want to apply it to every member of the group. And it's like, no, just because I said by and large, like I said earlier, by and large, women make more feminist art than men, does not mean every woman makes feminist art. Of course, everyone here knows that. But as it starts to circulate in general publics, people often want to pick up on whatever sounds sexy or dramatic or something like that. And you do, I think, have to be accountable not just for the work that you've done, but for doing the best you can to make sure that it stays true to itself as it gets disseminated.
And before we open it up for questions, I want to each also give you a minute to kind of ideate and dream with me and explore a dream scenario, because I think, I'm curious about what kinds of data you wish you had access to and what you could do with it. So, for me, when I think about how difficult it has been to get information from museums about the demographics of their collections. Some of them will give us a spreadsheet and we can do it ourselves, and some of them we have to go through their annual reports, and it's because they're surprised by the answer because they haven't done the work themselves. And so, it's a difficult and tricky thing to ask institutions to categorize their collections on the basis of demographics, but I also think it can be really illuminating. And so I would love to imagine a world where that's something that is at least happening on some level in the background. So if you had a fantasy ability to collect data on something, Camille, I'll start with you.
Okay. I was mentioning the archive as it is today. It's 600 bios of artists from all over the world, but that being said, it's not completely true. We have a lot of artists coming from Europe, North America, Latin America, but we do not have so many artists from Africa, from Asia. So my dream is that our data is more equally balanced between the 5 continents. It's a lot of work.
I think mine would maybe be, one is I study gender inequality in part because that is the data that is often available. Gender is, even when the data is missing, you can do what's called imputation with census records because gender names tend to be very gendered. And so you can just say, oh, most people with the name Stephanie are female, so I'll assume this is a female. You can't do that with race and ethnicity. It's not as clean. And often, there's government census in France that doesn't gather race or ethnicity or religious information. They have their reasons for that, but it does make it difficult to study the racial inequalities that might exist. So I would love to have data to be able to study race and ethnic disparities as well. And then a little tweak to your question, sharing of data. I think a lot of times institutions think they don't have data, and social scientists are like, yes, you have data I would love. The magazines, art criticism text, that is data. I have preliminary analysis looking at using large-scale text analysis to see how men and women are spoken about differently in art criticism texts. But I don't have a right to those texts, so I have to do the work to individually email these different magazines when I finally have time and say, listen, this is a good project. I'm not going to share your data with the world. You still have control over it. But it could tell us some really important things about historical trends. I think the same about museums. If you start a conversation with those who can analyze it, I think there can, as Artsy did with me, they were willing, when I first messaged them, they were willing to open that conversation and create a license agreement for us to do this together. Is I think could be really neat.
So 2 things I think that I've been dreaming of. To your point about taxonomies, I've been having a dream of a social justice metatagging project within the way that we think about our collections. There is no way, for instance, to connect the work of Alison Saar, whose work is in our collection, and her critical works around lynching in America with works that were made sort of around and about slavery. And I'm very interested in what starts to happen if we had a way of meta-tagging within our own collection databases to sort of begin to thematically connect these works through a social justice lens. So that's one project that's been on the back burner for a minute. And the other thing I'd love to know about my audiences is to be able to look at audience engagement sort of across entry points into the museum. Right now, we all kind of study engagement differently. There's, education does its thing with programs, and the development office does its thing with membership, and, curatorial does its thing with exhibition numbers. But if we can actually start to look at how a single visitor is sort of moving across different entry points of engagement, I think you start to get a really, really interesting story, and that's something that we do not have the ability to do yet. And if I could wave a magic wand, that would be an amazing thing to have.
Thank you so much. So let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have questions?
There's not much transparency about the price of the artworks. So the first question would be if you guys can point out to where can I get more data to do transparency of prices. And the second one is a little bit related. It's an aftermath of that. Usually we leave the artist at the beginning of the production, he created an artwork and that's it, goodbye. The rest of the art world and the enrichment comes from other sources. So somehow the artist could produce a great thing, be super famous, but he doesn't profit from the enrichment of the art dynamics. So is there anything that you have thought about that or something like that? That's my second question. Thank you very much.
I can talk a little bit about, pricing is the great black box, which makes so little sense because it is a market and yet pricing is so opaque. I I mean, I will say to toot the Artnet horn a little bit. Artnet does have a very comprehensive auction database, and so that's something where you can look that up. And I also, speaking of Artnet and data, I do have a few copies of our latest Artnet intelligence report, which looks at cumulative pricing data and trends over the last year, which I will be handing out at the end for anyone who wants one and gets to me before we run out. In terms of primary market pricing, I think it is still really rudimentary in the way that people are collecting it. I mean, there are press roundups and there are emails that go around, and I think the more that galleries are using online viewing rooms and things like that, where they're putting prices up front and making them accessible, that is shifting. But there is no, singular place where you can go and get primary market pricing right now. Unless any of you know of something that I don't.
Not about primary market pricing, though there are some interesting experiments that are being done right now around blockchain technology and being able to have the secondary market values accrue to the artist. And so that's something for us to keep our eyes on. There are a couple of experiments that are being done right now in that arena, which could prove really, really fruitful.
Yeah, and speaking of the resale question and the resale royalty, I mean, obviously the resale royalty, which would give artists in the U.S. a segment of their resale prices, has been struck down by the courts, and it's been snaking through in California, and then was ultimately struck down. But that is not to say that there are individual kind of artist-dealer relationships where that is baked in. So it's not an across-the-board thing, and it's not like a legal thing, but it is true, for example, like Jack Shainman is an artist where I know that, it is a gallery where I know that he gives his artists a portion of the resale if a work that he sold is sold back again through him. But it's like a good actor kind of on an individual level. It's not an industry-wide phenomenon right now. We have a mic coming around.
For the Baltimore Museum, are you doing the research primarily in-house? Are you working with like a second-party vendor researcher? And then how do you think about representation of the researcher themselves?
Oh, great question. We do a little bit of both. So I've been at the BMA for about 8 years now. When I came to the institution, we were doing a lot of out-of-house work. We were in the middle of a cascading series of renovations that had a lot of federal grant money attached to them. So there was a lot of money for that kind of very robust evaluation, both quant and qual. As those have died down, we've been looking at bringing that capacity in-house. And that's not simply because of the costs, although the costs are real, but also because I think that there's a real value in building a culture of evaluation within an institution. And so it was important to me to start building institutional capacity for that in-house. So we do a little bit of both now, depending upon the size of the project, the scale, and complexity. And then in terms of thinking about who is actually asking those questions, we have really just begun to look at what our vendor relationships look like through an equity lens. I think a lot of that work still remains to be done. I think that we've done a great job of the audience-facing equity work that we have done. I think that, like a lot of institutions, we changed what was easy to change quickly, right? So exhibition schedules, public programs, these kinds of things. Acquisitions take more time. Changing a culture takes more time, and making those HR changes need to be made take more time. So that is the next phase of work we're really embarking on.
Just out of curiosity, what did you do at the Baltimore Museum to attract more younger audience and more African minority groups? Yeah.
A number of engagements. It wasn't a sort of a single thing. I think it's been a constellation of efforts and initiatives that have added up to a cumulative effect. From where I sit and from what I control, we started a mobile museum project about 4 or 5 years ago now that did month-long residencies in communities around Baltimore, and that has translated into a satellite museum, a very, very small satellite museum that we have in a public market in Baltimore Baltimore. And so part of it was a rethinking of outreach and what I think of as kind of outreach 2.0, right? So it's not going out into communities as Lady Bountiful as we kind of do, as museums traditionally do, where we impart our wisdom from down on high, but being in dialogue with communities and shifting our artistic program based on community interest and need. And so a lot of those are like long, slow, trust-building conversations that take a lot of time on the one sort of end. And that stuff's actually very, very hard to measure, although we're in the middle of doing an evaluation on that right now. So that will be public by the end of this year. And then there are the splashier things. We looked at completely upending our exhibition schedule. So if anyone looked at what our slate of exhibitions looked like last year, you'll see a tremendous focus on African American artists. We did a complete collection reinstallation of our contemporary wing exclusively through the lens of African American creativity. And so those kinds of moves made consistently and over time, and that is the thing, it's the consistency of it, began to bring in those audiences, as well as, everybody loves those drinking in museums after dark programs, so we did a lot of those. Yeah.
What are the biggest dangers or downfalls in using data and algorithms to make decisions for museums and cultural institutions?
I'm not a practitioner in the museums, but of using the algorithms. And
you're going to caution us about it.
Yeah, if I were to caution you, there's two sides of this equation. There's what goes into the algorithm and what you do with what comes out of it. And so traditionally, methods of statistics are like what a lot of social scientists will do, are called inferential. You're trying to understand why the algorithm got the answer that it did. That's the whole point. But the new methods, that's not really the point. The point is this kind of black box conclusion that this algorithm gives you and you just go with. But the algorithms now are trained on our own data from the past. So if we're feeding it biased data, it's going to give us biased outcomes because it's just code. It's got no mind, And so you need to be able to step in and intervene within the algorithm, which this is kind of the cutting edge of a lot of this science now, which is what I was talking about before. The danger of just kind of using off-the-shelf algorithmic methods is that you don't know how it works, so you don't know how to fix it if it's doing something wrong. And in fact, even some of the leading experts don't. All of the tech companies out there right now are dealing with this problem of, I'm feeding it biased data, it's giving me biased answers. How do I stop it from doing that? That's the cutting edge right now. So my answer would just be make sure that you do, that whoever's using them knows not only the social world from which the data comes from, and the historical biases that social world has, but also understands the method enough to tweak it where it needs to be tweaked to make sure that it doesn't reproduce the problems. Because just to give a very practical example, if you were to feed it price data, and then you fed it men and women, male and female artworks by men and women, it most likely would discount female art the way we do as humans, but we don't want it to do that. So you need to be able to intervene there. In a way that's not damaging, though, because you can't necessarily just force answers that aren't in collaboration with the actual world.
Do we have time, Julia? You tell me Okay, so one more.
A very quick question.
Okay, this is completely different again. I follow a gallery, for instance, in New York called the 8th Floor. It's a non-commercial space. And they are always curating things that have social impact. So is there any database that I could follow artists that are, usually most of them are voicing out good things, but especially there's something that I can aggregate and follow, or? Thank you.
Don't know of a database that you can follow. I don't think anybody has put together a database of social practice artists in particular. Someplace that I might point you, though, in terms of institutions that are doing work around this would be the mass action initiatives. That is, museums as a site for social action. If you just Google mass action MIA, it will come up. It was a 3-year grant-funded initiative that the Minneapolis Institute of Art undertook for a number of years to create a toolkit for more equitable museums. And they have a resource page that will give you all the links that you want to everyone to follow on social who's really interested in these issues and is working on these issues.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the panelists. If you do want to pick up a copy of our intelligence report, I'm going to just grab them in the back, and I will stand right here. The cover story is on how our AI could transform the art industry, so there is a lot of overlap with what we've talked about here. Thank you all so much.